Hey, I'm Sean, host of The Gray Area. This week, we have a guest host, my friend and Vox colleague, Zack Beauchamp. He talks to Laura Field about the new right as an intellectual movement and why it matters, whether you're on the right or not. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be back hosting next week.
Laura Field, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you for having me.
In the book, you use the term new right to define, it's like an umbrella term for all of these different various pro-Trump factions, right? So what unites, in your view, like what makes the new right a cogent grouping, not just a random smattering of people who all like Trump? What connects them and what differentiates them from, on substantive grounds, not just like liking Trump versus not liking Trump, from the old right?
Sure. So I think I just want to make one little point here, which is that these terms are kind of weird and convoluted. So we in the States, it sort of took on the last few years to talk about the new right, but there are like 10 waves of new right in history. So like historians go crazy when you talk like this, because there's like an actual old right, which was in the early part of the 20th century. And so just to be clear, I'm talking about the MAGA New Right. It's kind of the latest iteration of a new kind of conservative intellectual movement. And it contrasts with, I don't call it the old right. I call it the the Reagan-Buckley right, or the establishment right, which is kind of what we were, if you're not 19, you're sort of, is your familiar conservative world, right? And so the Reagan-Buckley style of conservatism there's like a classic model of it. It's called the Gipper stool, and it's got these different sort of props that hold it up. So you've got fiscal conservatism, so free market economics, social conservatism, conservative social values, and then finally, anti-communism is sort of what held this fusionist vision together. And that really held a lot of sway until, at least in the conservative intellectual movement, until at least the end of the Cold War and beyond. So it's something, that's when we talk about the old establishment, I think we can think that's the substance. The new right turns against a lot of that. So Michael Anton, who was one of the first people to defend the new right and Trumpism from an intellectual standpoint, he has a great formula for the new right and for what Trumpism was. And he says it's economic nationalism, so turning against the free market orientation of the establishment, as well as closed borders or secure borders. So that's the anti-immigration strain, and America First foreign policy. And so that's obviously very different from the kind of liberal internationalism that grew out of the conservative anti-communism over the last, 50 years. So that's Mike Anton's formula, but I think that there's also just a strong, hardcore social conservatism that is quite extreme, quite reactive, that is sort of the core of a lot of this, at least sort of spiritually, how it gets motivated.
One thing I really liked that you did in the book is you brought out not just sort of these points of differentiation within the broad conservative movement between older and newer pro-Trump strains, but also I think identified some distinctive core values. One is nationalism, right? I think that's fairly straightforward. There's a deep commitment among all of these different groups to a vision of an assertive Americanness, and of, they may disagree on the content of what it means to be an American nationalist in different ways, but agree that something about the idea of the nation has to be front and center. But there's also another, I think, probably psychoanalytically connected thing that you bring up, which is a preoccupation with gender, right? It's not just social conservatism in general, though obviously there are concerns with race, sexual identity, trans identity, etc. But there's this real preoccupation with manliness and men and their proper relationship with women. And you also seem to notice that, like, actually in person, right? Like, you'd attend these events and there would be some weird comment that someone would make about you or about a woman being there or about women in general, almost like designed to provoke, that would come up. So what is this sort of gendered core of this? And when you read the book, it's obvious that the authors are overwhelmingly male that you're talking about, right? Like what's the gendered core here, and how important is that to understanding what's happening with this movement writ large?
Yeah. So, I mean, this was super striking to me from the beginning, just because it's something I've thought a lot about, having been part of some of these circles, or at least adjacent circles. And I was treated very well in academia by my male mentors and things. So this isn't sort of a vulnerable Me Too story. Like, I genuinely was treated very well. But the gender dynamics in these circles, even in the best sort of most upstanding circles, are still quite strange and just traditional, right? You kind of have gendered panels at conferences, that sort of thing. But the extent to which the book is about that was kind of a surprise to me. Like, the book doesn't profile any women academics, and that's because there aren't really any with that kind of profile who I thought were sort of had the profile that warranted a whole chapter. And so and I kept puzzling over, like, am I missing somebody? Is there is there a woman here who's respected by these men who should be elevated? And it just didn't happen. And so I thought, well, this is, I think, the reality of what is going on. And I wasn't that puzzled by it. I mean, they don't really respect women. They have a whole battery of intellectual formulations to exclude women and reasoning behind that. And I'm familiar with a lot of those ideas. So that happened pretty organically. Being in these spaces is sort of strange. I was in some of those spaces mainly after I had started writing about the New Right. And so part of it was they sort of, I think they knew who I was. And so they weren't horrible to me or anything, but there were certainly some vibes that were strange. But it's so dramatic, just the extent to which it's mostly men. I think it comes through more in their writing than in their personal behavior, to be honest, because some of their writing is so misogynist and just so medieval almost. That maybe that's not fair to the medievalists, but it's just backwards, right? And really archaic in its thinking.
Okay, so one thing that you've alluded to, but I think is like really central to understanding what's going on, is that while the New Right has these shared sets of principles in common, or like the grouping that we call the New Right, right? They have this preoccupation with gender, there's strong support for Trump, a general disinterest in abiding by the traditional norms of democratic politics, a commitment to like unremitting culture war against the left. Like these are all like defining traits. But there are huge divisions between the different sub-factions that make up the New Right. So if you were to divide them into sort of main camps, what would you say the fault lines between those camps are?
Sure. So I sort of have three main camps, which are the Claremonters, the post-liberals, and the national conservatives. And then I talk also about the hard right, but the hard right kind of travels alongside all three of them ideologically. But the hard right is kind of the hardcore manosphere fascist types. And each of these groupings are different. The Claremonters are really committed or at least in theory, to the American founding. And so they have this very sort of grandiose vision of what the American founding was that's beyond even your ordinary patriotism. It's that this is the best regime of all time. And they're also at the very cutting edge of the culture war. So it's the best regime of all time, but we've completely lost the plot, and the sort of liberals and liberal way of thinking has taken over to such a degree that we basically need a counter-revolution. So they're really far gone in the culture warring. They're sort of the January 6th types, right, who defended some of that anything
Michael
goes.
Anton, who you mentioned earlier, who's now a Trump administration official,
Michael Anton, John Eastman,
like
these
one of the key
types.
leaders in that faction.
Yeah. So they're pretty radical. And then there's the national conservatives, which I treat as sort of an umbrella group for everything, but they're sort of a little more vanilla, with just nationalism as their core central thing. And but it turns into kind of ethno-nationalism in some cases, and certainly also Christian nationalism, the main guy has advocated for. So, but they're sort of a big tent. Everyone's welcome in that grouping. And I'll say a little bit more about the tensions, because the tensions are clearest when you were talking about the post-liberals, who are the kind of the most highbrow of the New Right, and they tend to be Catholic intellectuals. So we're thinking about people like Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, Patrick Deneen, who is quite a important figure in the movement now. Sohrab Ahmari might be someone that listeners have heard of. And so these are sort of serious Catholics who are more committed to the social conservatism and really want to shape the morals of the country, I think, in a much more sort of traditional Catholic direction. But they're also, interestingly, much more sincere, I think, about the social, the economic, not economic nationalism, but kind of a more left-oriented economics, so a more government-led economics. And the New Right as a whole speaks that way, as if they want to help the working class, create new programs, do this kind of populist thing economically. But I think that the people who are closest to Trump, which are Claremont and the NatCons and sort of the Project 2025 people, they haven't really followed through. They've got the tariffs, but otherwise economically, they're still doing the big tax cuts. They're still kind of beholden to donors. And so that's been a big fissure because the post-liberals, I think, are quite sincere in their desire to have they're almost open to socialism, right? So that's sort of the most dramatic fissure, I think, comes along with the different versions of the economic possibilities and what people are open to and how sincerely they're committed to that. There are a lot of other ones just in terms of how accepting they are of the hard right. Sohrab Ahmari is someone who's been quite outspoken against the sort of Proud Boys and that kind of that vector and the manosphere. So what you get is this complete tangle of ideas. I think you get surprising, these men are all reaching back to surprising sources and using them in their own ways. And you can have someone like Adrian Vermeule, who's inspired by Carl Schmitt, who is kind of, you can identify, partly he was in they called him the crown jurist of the Third Reich, right? Like he became a Nazi and was very important, at least at the beginning of the Nazi regime for his legal arguments. And you get someone like Adrian Vermeule who's inspired by that. So again, I'm not saying you're wrong that there are these big conflicts, but sometimes it's almost like the movement is so powerful that the incoherence becomes its own kind of loyalty test. They're so united on some of their political propositions and some of the radicalism that sort of, and their anti-liberalism, that I find the intellectual distinctions very interesting. And I think there are resources there for people who want to combat some of this, to call them out on some of this, but I don't know how much it matters practically.
Well, I mean, it's what you're describing are the dynamics of a united political coalition, right? But the point is, right, what they all agree on is that right-wing politics properly construed means the demolition of American liberalism, the end, not just, of liberalism in the sense of the Democratic Party, but in the sense of a system that is guided by principles of individual liberty, free enterprise, at least to a limited degree, and the basic ideas of, state non-interference, individuals as rights bearers who can make claims against the state. And that's sort of the primary purpose of politics, is to allow those people to pursue the vision of life that they choose, right? And the state enables that and provides the background conditions that make people capable of being free, right? That's, like, broadly speaking, the liberal vision of politics. And every single one of these movements is for their own reasons, right? Arranged against that, which I think it's not the only American political tradition, but it's certainly the one enshrined in the founding.
Can I say one more thing here quickly?
Yeah, please, Laura. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just think it's important because, I mean, and this might be a place where you and I don't think we disagree, but where my framing of some of this is different from yours. One thing I think that I'm emphasizing differently is that these movements, as you've noted, there's this huge incoherence. They all have many of them have quite a different conception of the good or of what they hold to be the ideal, whether it's the founding of some, the Republican founding, nationalism, or the Catholic conception of the good, a very traditional Catholic conception of the good. But I think it's important to recognize that they are driven by the good in a way, and sort of these thick conceptions of the good, comprehensive doctrines. And I think that that's kind of a useful way to think about it, where I don't think liberals quite get in general how driven these people are or think they are. There's plenty of politics that's just convenience, marriage of convenience, but a lot of them really think that they are pursuing they're fanatics. They're pursuing their own ideals. They think that these ideals are in so much peril. Their way of life is in so much peril that that they need to oppress everyone else. And so I think just the psychology there it's worth just kind of really being clear about that they think they're doing something that's good for everybody because their idea of the good is true. And even when they conflict with one another, they don't conflict enough that they can't agree on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I think one of the common threads in New Right thinking is that what we call liberalism is actually, not a doctrine of limiting state power, but a doctrine of cultural aggression against people like them in the way that you just described. But there really is a sense that they're waging a defensive culture war, even if what they're responding to is something like the legalization of same-sex marriage, which was a seminal moment, especially for post-liberals. But for most of us, I mean, I am in an opposite-sex marriage. It does not, the quality of that is not degraded by the existence of same-sex marriage, right? Like, that's kind of crazy, it seems to me, to read that as cultural aggression. But that is how it's perceived, right? That's how it's understood.
No, but one thing that frustrates me is I wish that, I don't want liberals to, fight fire with fire, but I do think we need a little more robust defensive liberalism. And so that's partly what my book is about too, is just having a little more spine and backbone instead of caving to these things, even just ideologically.
Support for The Gray Area comes from another podcast. August 2025. It's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina. Where the Schools Went is a new 5-part podcast series about what happened to the schools in New Orleans after the levees broke, and how it led to the most radical education experiment in American history. Hosted by Ravi Gupta, a former school principal, Where the School Went traces the decades of dysfunction before Katrina and the high-stakes decisions that followed. On the podcast, you'll hear from veteran educators who lost their jobs, idealists and outsiders who rushed in after the storm, and students and families who lived through it all. From the branch, in partnership with the 74 and Midas Touch, Where the Schools Went is out now, wherever you get your podcasts. Support for today's show comes from GiveWell. You might have read news on some of the massive cuts happening to foreign aid. And with everything going on, it might be hard to know what's actually happening, or even how to help. GiveWell doesn't claim to have all the answers, but for the past 18 years, the nonprofit research organization says they have helped guide more than 130,000 donors and $2.5 billion to highly cost-effective aid. They really do terrific work. The researchers are analyzing the impact of the cuts to USAID in real time and sharing what they're learning through research updates, grant write-ups, and candid podcast conversations. This information is free and for everyone. GiveWell says they have already committed tens of millions of dollars in response to this year's cuts, and their researchers are working to forecast, find, and fund other new cost-effective needs. For trusted, evidence-backed insights into this evolving situation and information about how you can help, follow along at givewell.org/USAID.
A skeptical listener at this point might wonder, what are you guys talking about? Like, literally, who cares about any of this, right? Because these are people having arguments in small blogs, and maybe it spills out into a newspaper or magazine occasionally, but it's on podcasts, on YouTube, whatever. Whereas, like, what, the actual decision makers, the people who are literally attacking American democracy and liberalism, are people like Donald Trump, who don't care at all about what's happening in these world of ideas. Now, you've spent a while studying these people. You've thought about them a lot. Why do you think any of this is something that matters for our politics?
Well, I think that, first of all, the knee-jerk reaction to think who cares is a natural one, because a lot of these people are surprisingly bizarre, and it is it's alarming to see them wield so much power. It's alarming to see J.D. Vance have that kind of clout. And so I don't think we want to lose sight of that initial kind of surprise and curiosity. a lot of it has been opportunism. So you have sort of weirdos coming in. But I think they've dramatically reoriented the GOP. My book's also about sort of just how a lot of the barriers between the far right, the alt-right, and the establishment have completely gone away. And so you have arguments that are not new. We call it the new right, but a lot of these are sort of latent on the conservative side, going back 50 years to Goldwater, to Buchanan, and sort of the birthers and the Birchers and this sort of conspiracism and racism and anti-civil rights stuff that has been a big part of the intellectual world on the right for decades and decades. And so now it's not unprecedented. We could talk about continuities with the past or discontinuities, and the discontinuities are there in the intellectual world where you have all these weird, formerly fringe people coming in and taking over. But it's not just a novel thing. It's also these old strains, these old sort of archaic, what you would probably call the authoritarian traditions, right, in the American past coming up to the surface. And so there's a lot to work with there. It's not just some radically new thing. And I think it seems to matter a lot to the young people. These kinds of movements, I think, can build energy. And so young men, I think, are influenced by these circles, because a lot of these people I'm writing about, I've sort of cordoned off the people into the sort of intellectual spheres, and we could debate how intellectual, how savvy, how smart they are.
Sure.
But they're pretty smart, and they've got a lot of them have PhDs, which is no marker of, genius or anything, but it's easy they have really a lot of education, a lot of resources available to them. They're experts in ways that would surprise, I think, most listeners, right? They know a whole lot. I wouldn't want to debate some of them on, the founding or other questions. It's difficult. They're very well-learned people. And they are shaping the minds of people like Joe Rogan and some of these much more popular figures. So, and I think that's kind of how it works. I think ideologically, there is kind of a trickle-down effect. The culture war stuff has a big impact. We could talk about how much the economic dimensions of the economic problems of the country matter for this movement, the working class populism stuff. But part of it is that they say it does, right? And they argue that that's their pitch. And it's not hard to make people feel like they have economic woes, right? Or that they're suffering. I mean, we all struggle. So I think that a lot of the culture warring is a top-down phenomenon. And that's how they think about it. And they're very good at the culture warring, and it does have an impact. So, I mean, those are some of the main things.
So you have a really lovely phrase for a certain kind of right-wing thinking about how politics works, which is ideas first. One thing that you suggest is distinctive about all right-wing traditions, not just the radical right, but the sort of American right in general, is that they think ideas have a kind of independent causal force, right? Like they matter, they come from somewhere perhaps, but they can take on a life of their own. They matter in and of themselves. I think that's true in a really important sense, in a way that's underappreciated by a lot of people on the left. And it almost seems like we're living in this world where the right is proving its own theory of politics, right? Its ideas first vision, that when you write things down, that has tangible effects on what happens in the political world, right? That they're proving that through their own actions. Right, through influencing people like J.D. Vance, through getting people like Michael Anton into high-level State Department positions, right? It's like the world we live in now is in large part being shaped by, the scribblers of not as some long-dead philosophers, Keynes once said, but, some living kind of philosophers.
Yeah, I call it the ideas first, but it's also a kind of intellectual fanaticism, right? Each different camp has a commitment to a certain vision of politics, of the good, of how we ought to live, right? They're very attached to these ideas, but the conservative movement as a whole has for quite some time now in the United States had this sort of similar understanding of how ideas shape the world and why ideas matter. You can go back to a book called Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, which is from the 50s, that talks about, he traces the problems of modernity He traces how the fall of modernity and sort of all the problems that we have today trace back to the introduction of nominalism, which is the idea that ideas don't have permanent value. It was sort of out there in the world, but rather, concepts actually only exist sort of materially, that there's no sort of universal truths, that it's all sort of embedded in our material world. So they all sort of hate this modern relativism, materialism, historicism. These are kind of some of the big ideas that they think have destroyed modern life, because we don't have an anchor, right, in liberal modernity for our way of life and our belief systems. We don't have a common set of norms and values and beliefs that anchors us together and allows us to make decisions about politics, or, we have structures that help us. We have democratic systems that help us make these decisions and negotiate these things. But they really think that you need to have a coherent sort of moral ecosystem that holds everybody together to have good politics. And I think that's a major driving force of the right.
I want to sit on that for a second. That's fascinating. So what you're saying is that ideas first isn't just, a theory that it matters to develop ideas, to make arguments in the public realm, or to make intellectual arguments, and then you have some reason to believe that filters downstream. It's that ideas matter in the sense that they construct the reality, the social structure in which we live, and that part of the purpose of developing or making these seemingly wild arguments is to redefine and reset out a set of new moral norms that shape the way that ordinary everyday people think about their worlds. But more concretely, if you're a Catholic integralist like Adrian Vermeule, who thinks that we should live in a society where the state is implementing very literally Catholic social doctrine, like acting as the church's agent in a lot of ways, what you're doing in writing is trying to create a world in which that becomes more thinkable, to create a new morality from the pages of Substacks with 5,000 followers or whatever, right? I'm not saying that to make it sound delusional, right? Because there actually has
I
been
think
a
that's
lot more
right. I mean,
influence than
it
people
sounds,
have, yeah.
That's why it's so interesting, because and they're reaching back. What they're talking about is a regime that's dedicated to being virtuous, right? That's old Platonic language, Aristotelian language, or civic republicanism, which is very, I mean, to me, those things are very appealing. But the modern regime, liberal democracy, does not focus on that. But they think that to have a healthy politics, to have a good politics that people can participate in and flourish in, requires doctrines that shape us in those ways, in our education, right, in our laws all the way down. So you can find quotes like this, about the need for a virtuous citizenry, right, in John Adams and in the founding. So it's not completely foreign to the tradition, but they are really running with it. I think it's fair to say, and it's often very detached from the empirical world of what life is like in the United States, from just any sort of good faith understanding of what liberal democracy is and how liberals live. They think we all live tawdry, amoral lifestyles, but I think they're quite delusional about that. I guess one other thing I want to say is that we do need ideas. So one of the reasons I highlight that is that, as I sort of say in my conclusion, Democrats tend to put ideas last, it seems to me. They're very wonkish, and I love them for that, but there's a kind of disconnect there with how the culture warring on the right and the kind of procedural, quietist approach on the left, generally speaking. And so the conservatives would not agree with my assessment there. They think that the left is just a complete culture warrior juggernaut, but I disagree. And I think we do need ideas, and we need good ideas. And the American founding is often thought of as sort of a creed. America's thought of as a creedal nation, right, where we're united by ideas about equality and liberty. And the New Right rejects those ideas in particular. And so I'm not just trying to attack an ideas first approach. I think that we need some of that in our politics.
I really loved this passage from your book where you talked about how liberals and Democrats are putting ideas last. Where you said that having incubated them into an AI lab, tested them against a dozen polls, and assigned them to a celebrity to rehearse. and that one of the most frustrating experiences for any liberal observer of the New Right was to witness again and again the incredible contrast between the coarse brazenness of its ideologues and the tepid intellectual reserve and cluelessness and cowardice of so many centrist and liberal leaders, both within academia and beyond. Of course, there are exceptions, but not nearly enough. That is a stinging indictment on your part of the sort of liberal intellectual class. When you say that they've failed in contrast to the coarse brazenness of the New Right, like, what do you mean by that specifically?
I think I was finalizing those passages sort of in the early part of this year, right? January 2025, I guess, right? And so we see the administration coming in. I mean, I was surprised, even though I knew I've written about how much more prepared they would be this time around than the New Right was last time. And Trump had a lot more, has been much more effective in his, the administration has done a lot more, I think it's fair to say. And they did a lot last time. And so the response on the Democrats' part, I mean, they're in a difficult position. They had a very rocky electoral cycle with Biden staying in so long and Harris then kind of in this awful position of having to parachute in and not being very well prepared, perhaps. So, I mean, the frustration was with all of that. But I think it's something that I've seen for a long time. I don't feel like there's much of a response intellectually to what's going on. Academics don't have a lot to say. I mean, there's a lot of talk, I guess, but it doesn't seem to me like the party has much to offer on this front, right? On the ideological front. Again, like you said, it's a sharp critique. I still I think they're in a very difficult position and I don't know the answers. So I was vague intentionally, but it is frustrating as an observer to see a sort of Bernie and AOC were the people who went and toured the country, right? And had a lot of energy in those first months. But I didn't see, more centrist Democrats doing very much. And I still think that's the case. They seemed very shocked, very unprepared. And I think that sort of comes down to a failure of imagination, maybe taking way too much for granted for a very long time. And that's part of what got us Trump in the first place.
Support for the show comes from Bombas. You know those songs that make you just want to run? Maybe you're in the middle of a workout and you're totally spent, but then that one track hits. Maybe it's Tool, maybe it's a little Wu-Tang, and boom, you're back. That's kind of like what Bombas socks do. You put them on and you're ready to go. This summer, you can get moving with Bombas socks, specially designed to wick sweat, keep you cool, and prevent blisters. You probably know I've tried out Bombas for myself. They are my favorite socks. In the winter and fall, I rock their wool socks because I wear boots a lot, and they're super thick but still breathable. Now that it's 500 degrees down here on the Gulf Coast, my go-to socks are their lightweight athletic socks. They are comfortable and they really do keep you cool and dry. You can head over to bombas.com/gray area and use code gray area for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/gray area, code gray area at checkout. Support for this show comes from Mint Mobile. Great summers have a lot of ingredients. Lake trips, jet skiing, maybe a few overpriced summer camps. But one thing that doesn't belong in your summer is getting burned by your wireless bill. With Mint Mobile, you can get the coverage and speed you're used to, but for way less money. Right now, Mint Mobile is offering 3 months of unlimited premium wireless service for $15 a month. They say all their plans come with high-speed 5G data and unlimited talk and text. Plus, they say you can bring your own phone and phone number along with all your contacts to your new Mint plan. This year, you can skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. You can get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/gray area. That's mintmobile.com/gray area. Support for the show comes from Shopify. When you're starting a new business, it can feel like you're expected to do it all. Marketing, design, and everything in between, even if you've never done half of it before. What you really need is a tool that helps you reach your goals without having to master every skill yourself. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Their design studio lets you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand style, letting you choose from hundreds of ready-to-use templates. You can also set up your content creation by using their helpful host of AI tools. And you can even create email and social media campaigns with ease and meet your customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling. See why Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world. If you're ready to sell, you can be ready with Shopify. You can turn your big business idea into a reality with Shopify on your side. You can sign up for your $1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.com/Vox. Go to shopify.com/Vox. Shopify.com/Vox.
If you look at academic political philosophy and political theory, liberalism is the dominant doctrine. Why hasn't this intellectual dominance translated into a forceful ideas-first intellectual response to the new right?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of getting speculative, but I guess it's fair because there's some speculation in my book.
We're
but
on a
I mean,
podcast.
one of
That's
the
what you
through
do. You
lines in my
speculate. You
book has to do with high. Yeah, okay, fine. One of the through lines is higher education, right? And how the right has attacked higher education, not just in the present, but of course going back quite a while, for its liberal dominance, its the affirmative action, everything's wrong with academia. And so a big part of what they've been trying to do is to retake some of these institutions. They've got parallel institutions that they've built up. There's just a lot going on there, which is, it's just to say that's their take on academia. And I think part of what you're talking about in our politics does have to do with the liberal domination of academia. Insofar as our politicians, it's partly a problem of liberalism. I mean, some of these things are, the new right has been able to capitalize off of all of these sort of thick moral conceptions and these big questions about how to live, partly because we don't do that as liberals, right? Liberalism sort of cordons off some of those questions, and its origins were to help people navigate and get along given huge existential differences, right? And spiritual differences and strife. So religious warfare. And so liberalism was invented partly to avoid some of these big ideas, questions. And so I think the answer to why our politicians democratic politicians, liberal politicians are not better equipped to confront some of these ideas is partly because they haven't been educated in milieus that cultivate that, right? There's a kind of educational formation that is lacking, I think, in some of our liberal circles. And you mentioned academic political philosophy, which is so dominated by liberals. That's pretty much true. But there's not always space in those circles to explore questions of the good life. It's almost taken off the table.
I mean, it strikes me that there's a bit of a trade-off here in sort of like intellectual work between rigor and relevance. And I'm going to be overgeneralizing here, but it seems like one of the problems, right, of the academy in general is that there are so many procedures in place for accuracy, for disciplinary precision and stuff like that, just sort of like the way that people operate, the rules that you have to follow, that you produce work that is technically well-reasoned, very thoughtful, but oftentimes extremely narrow. Whereas out there in the wilds of Claremontistan or, small Substacks, right? Like you can just take on these huge ideas and maybe make all sorts of technical or factual errors, right? I find that a lot when I'm reading new right arguments. Is like I have to fact check everything because you don't have the sort of reliability of the peer review process or the citation practices. There's just always these wild sweeping generalizations, oftentimes without sufficient evidence to back them up. And yet that makes things exciting, right? It makes things fun. It makes people like J.D. Vance, who are ideas hungry politicians, latch onto them. And there's not that world out there that can foster the level of excitement. I don't know if inaccuracy is like necessary to excitement, like if you have to do both of those things, but I feel like the lack of strict academic norms surrounding accuracy, precision,
You're putting
and
this very
incrementalism
politely.
really have contributed to the New Right's success as like an ideas merchant to the political class.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things I try to get at is some of the insularity in some of this work. I mean, like I said, you're putting it very nicely. Some of those circles, that's what frustrated me about my own education, is it seemed quite insular. I started to see beyond some of this very clearly, and just and then when I go back and read these books, it's a lot of it's just factually incorrect or just completely blinkered in terms of its understanding of history. So it'll take on, and that's part of the ideas first thing. It doesn't care about, the failures of Reconstruction or Jim Crow. It just runs with a certain kind of narrative, and it's kind of ugly. And so that's partly what gives them license to spout off the way they do in other quarters, right? When they're on their Substacks or on their podcasts. And so it's a mix of, genuine education and a kind of a kind of formation that's just very different from what we get in liberal academia. Partly that, and partly just an insularity and a failure of professional norms and standards. And so in academia, you do have these conservative enclaves, and some of them I do respect and I think are serious, and others are not. But I think in academia as a whole, if we're going to get into the nitty gritty here, you have a whole slew of problems, but one of them really is the hyper specialization. And professionalization is fine, but when it becomes intellectual sort of narrow-mindedness, and that happens in every field, and then there are trends that dominate, and there's a kind of myopia, and there's sort of a lack of checks against some of that. And I think that in liberal academia, there's a kind of contempt for the generalist, right? There's a real contempt for popular writing. And for journalism sometimes, right? Because it's not so fussy, and it has something bigger to say, and it is sort of more ideas first, or it's going to be, it was hard for me to get comfortable writing even for a broader audience as an academic, because it feels, it's just a very different kind of activity. There isn't a place for this sort of broad formative thing that I'm talking about, which isn't to say we want to indoctrinate people into a particular set of values in our undergraduate programs, but at least to expose them to these other ways of thinking and sort of bigger traditions, bigger questions.
One thing I think that is very true about liberalism is sort of its anthropology, its sense that it is just a fact about the world, that we're not going to agree about everything, that we are going to live in a society where people have very different beliefs, very different backgrounds, very different worldviews, very different things that they care about, and that no society can function well when it doesn't provide room for different kinds of people to be themselves, right? And it will eventually founder and collapse. And that's very valuable for liberalism. And on the flip side, it means that the New Right has this real problem with its doctrinal disagreements, because everybody is asserting that my vision of the world is good and true, and if you don't agree with it, you're a heretic. Maybe not even like, and justifiably can be persecuted. And so I wonder how much you see a possibility on the horizon when Donald Trump is either term limited out or he dies, that the New Right can no longer function well as a cogent political bloc because it lacks liberalism's ability to productively, brook and channel dissent and disagreement about really key issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the latent sort of vulnerability here, is that there are these deep disagreements, and there are two. There's the fact that they disagree with themselves, and then there's the fact that they don't really understand and don't know how to. I don't think they're very honest with themselves about the extent to which the liberal side actually is potent, disagrees, doesn't want this, and is going to fight for itself. Even if I say they're not very good at the arguments in some extent or have been a little lackluster, I think that the right completely underestimates the power of the, even at their most sort of fanatical, they tend to underestimate the extent to which actual people are committed to liberalism and to liberal pluralism. So I think that's a real vulnerability. I do think you're right that when Trump is out of the picture, there will be a lot of uncertainty. But I think that it's still very complicated. And I still think that we need to do better as liberals. Like, you're a very good advocate for liberalism, Zack. And
thank you.
And we need more of that. We need, even if we don't decide that we're going to teach liberalism in our colleges or start new civics institutions devoted to liberal pluralism and the meaning of life, we need people to be able to be conversant the way you are in these values. And we need, I think, our politicians to be a little more on the offense in terms of what they believe in, because I think it is very appealing to many people. I think you're right in your book when you talk about these sort of what people want out of politics and what the new right has to offer are quite different, right? These are very strange ideologies that. And so it could throw us back in kind of like a period of deep fanatical disagreement where we're warring with each other. If sort of they get their way, I think that's what might happen. The right might start getting more combative with one another. But I think more likely is that this movement will continue, but perhaps be relegated to the states, sort of in a decentralized. What would have happened, I think, had Trump not won this time, would have been that they were building the way to work their way through the federal system and take over in red states and oppress people through their laws, right? And through their new right ideas. So I think that we don't want to get too complacent just because we know that Trump is the glue holding all of this together right now.
I was about to say, right, like assuming the Trump movement fails and we don't have a red Caesar who imposes some weird vision of evangelical/Catholic law on the rest of us. Again, I really get hung up on the contradictions in this project, right? And the way in which it doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, it really. But look, Laura, I want to thank you for just a fascinating discussion, and I hope all of our listeners come out and will pre-order the book if you are interested in what Laura has to say, and if not, go buy it in November when it's hitting the shelves. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Zack. And they should do a 1-2, guys. I think my book follows up pretty well on yours. So if they haven't,
The Reactionary Spirit, it is available wherever you purchase your books.